In this module, I will be discussing the concept of performance. I will talk now about the evaluation of performance, both in terms of sources and in terms of rating forms. And then I will talk about variability of performance and have an example of someone discussing their performance evaluation experience. So we talked about selecting people based on an acceptable level of performance, and then doing a validation study to see if the selection procedure actually gives us the best performers. But what is performance, and how do we measure it? And how do we determine if someone is doing an acceptable job? Let's take an example job, say a waiter, waitress, something most of us have either done or experienced from the customer side, and look at some of the job tasks. Waiters and waitresses must check patrons' identification in order to ensure they are of the minimum age for alcoholic beverages. They need to collect payments from customers, write patrons' food orders, etc. Will a waiter or waitress be successful if he or she performs only some of these things? Are some things more important than others? If we were to ask a waiter or waitress if they were doing a good job, what would we want to know about? Let's say we have an evaluation that asks about taking and delivering orders to customers, but fails to ask about tallying the bill and collecting payment. Would it be a good evaluation of the employee? What if someone is good at taking and delivering orders, but yet fails to collect payment or incorrectly charges customers? This is probably not a good evaluation then, if we're just looking at taking and delivering orders. We'll have some major problems at the business if the waiter or waitress does not also collect payment. When we miss out on evaluating part of the job, we call it criterion deficiency with the evaluation method. So we use the word criterion to talk about job performance. But what are criteria? Criteria are standards that we use to help make evaluative judgments about objects, people, or events. It can be anything, really. And we use these even if we aren't aware of it. How do we judge the quality of a movie or a restaurant or a gift that someone gave us? What criteria might we use for some of these? People often disagree in their evaluation of the same event or the same object. Take, for example, Walmart. What we find is that people are often using different criteria to judge that object or event. So one person may judge Walmart based on its record of how it has treated or mistreated employees. Another may base it on the jobs it has provided, particularly in rural areas that don't have very many other employers. Still others may judge it strictly on the basis of a customer looking for the best value. So we have different judgment outcomes because people are using different criteria. So we have what are called theoretical and actual criteria. Theoretical criteria are the theoretical or conceptual standards that researchers seek to understand. It's an abstract idea, like the constructs we talked about before. In performance, it would be what good performance really is. But then we have actual criteria, which are the way in which the theoretical or conceptual criteria is assessed or measured. It's the operational definition. and it's the performance appraisal technique that we use. So if we look at some jobs, we can look at the theoretical and actual criteria that are used with that job. So for an artist, the theoretical criterion may be creating great works of art. But how do we measure that? One option is to look at the judgments of art experts. So this would be our actual criterion. For an insurance salesperson, their theoretical criterion is to sell insurance. But what do we actually look at? It may be the monthly sales. And a store clerk should be providing good service to customers. And how do we find that out? It may be through a survey of customer satisfaction. A teacher is supposed to impart knowledge to students. And we can try to assess that based on student achievement test scores. A weather forecaster, we're hoping accurately predicts the weather. And we measure this by comparing predictions to actual weather. Because the theoretical criterion is just that, theoretical, we don't really know how deficient or relevant or contaminated the criteria are, the actual criteria. So we can look at the relationship between the actual criteria and the conceptual criteria. So let's look at this diagram. The conceptual criterion is the performance in its ideal form. It is everything that the job requires the employee to do. The actual criterion is the measure of performance, which may or may not accurately represent the conceptual criterion. If all of performance is not measured in our evaluation, we call it criterion deficiency. So this upper circle has everything that we expect the employee to do. But when we measure, we often don't capture all of that. We capture a portion of it. So the portion we're missing is our deficiency. Criterion relevance is a term we use to describe the extent to which the actual criterion, the measure, assesses the theoretical criterion. This is our construct validity. And you can see the relevance here, this overlap, is where that measure is accurately measuring what our conceptual criterion is. Our criterion contamination is the part of the criterion measure that reflects something other than what it was designed to measure. Sometimes this can be biases we have or systematic measuring of something other than the criterion. It can also come from random noise or error, something unrelated to anything. So one example of criterion contamination could be the rater's mood on the day that they're rating the employees. If they're in a bad mood, there may be a systematic shifting to a more negative rating for one or all employees. It's important to try and find criterion measures that are good at representing the conceptual criterion, that covers all parts of job tasks and doesn't measure unimportant or unrelated things. Let's look at GPA as a measure of the conceptual criterion of being a good college student. How relevant is GPA? Well, part of being a good student is performing well in class and meeting the expectations of your professors. In that sense, GPA is getting to that aspect of being a good college student. How deficient is GPA as a measure of a good college student? A good student may be somebody who contributes to the university in other ways than just their classroom performance. It may be someone who plays sports for the school, participates in charities, participates in other extracurricular activities, maybe is a tutor on campus. These aspects are not being measured by GPA. And how contaminated? What about college major? It affects actual criterion because it will affect things like GPA and time spent doing extracurricular activities. Some engineering or music majors may not have the time to do extra things. But it's not a part of conceptual criterion. A person with any major should be able to be a good college student. So when we are discussing the measurement of job performance, what are some of the things we should consider? Performance is the set of actions or behaviors of an employee. It's relevant to the organization's goals. It's what employees are hired to do. And we need to be careful because it is the action or behavior itself. It shouldn't be the consequences of the action. If a salesperson is doing all the right things and making calls, connecting, even making convincing sales pitches, but yet are getting very few bites on actual sales, it is tempting to say that the salesperson is not doing a good job. However, when we say this, we really mean that he or she is not effective, which is the result of the performance, not the performance itself. Other factors contribute to the effectiveness of one's performance. So we have some related terms to performance. That is effectiveness, the evaluation of the results of performance, which are not always under an individual's control. And we have productivity, which is the ratio of effectiveness to the cost of achieving that level of effectiveness. It's essentially the profit margin. So if we look at the research and trying to understand what performance is, we often look to a standard model that was developed in 1993 by Campbell and his colleagues. They set up this model based on research that was done for Project A, which is the project that was done to validate the ASVAB that I discussed in the history section. But it was adapted to be applicable to all jobs, not just the military. This model has been widely accepted by people in the field. So according to the model, there are 3 determinants of performance. These consist of declarative knowledge, which is knowing what to do, procedural knowledge, which is knowing how to do it, and motivation, which is responsible for variations in intensity and quality of work. It's inducing people to perform better or longer. It's the fact that they will do the work instead of that they can do the work. And that's an important distinction that we'll come back to later. The difference between being able to do something and actually doing it. So these determinants lead to performance outcomes. Not all of them are present in all jobs, but all of them are under the direct control of the worker. The first 3 things are essential to all jobs. That is job-specific task proficiency. It's the ability to do the core technical aspects of the job. The second piece is maintaining personal discipline, essentially avoiding negative behaviors like absenteeism and substance abuse on the job, or violating rules or laws. And the third component that is essential to all jobs is demonstrating effort. This is the consistency of effort, putting in extra effort, and continuing through adverse conditions. So these next components are things that are not found in all jobs. This includes things such as facilitating peer and team performance, non-specific task proficiency, communication, supervision and leadership, which is the proficiency at influencing the performance of others, and management, administration, organizing people and resources, and helping to solve problems. We will discuss when we talk about leadership that there is a difference between leadership and management, and that's why they're separated out here. So I want to mention a difference between task and contextual performance. This was a distinction that was made a little bit later. Contextual performance supports the organization, the social, psychological, organizational environment in which the job tasks are performed. It's common to most jobs, so what contextual performance is would be similar across jobs. We find that differences in contextual performance is tied somewhat to personality. Now, this contextual performance is not part of the job description itself. These are all different from what we call task performance. Task performance is the proficiency at performing the tasks that are required as a formal part of the job. This is what's in the job description, the job tasks. And this is what the employees are paid for. And it's generally what's in performance evaluations. And it's what employees get trained to do. Contextual performance is a little different than this. It's not technically part of the job, but yet it does often contribute to ratings of overall performance. And it helps the organization. It helps the organization run smoother. So dimensions of contextual performance include persisting with enthusiasm and extra effort in one's tasks, volunteering to carry out tasks not part of one's job, helping and cooperating with others, following organizational rules and procedures, and endorsing, supporting, and defending organizational objectives. In some sense, it's being a good citizen of the organization. And it's often considered similar to a construct we call organizational citizenship behavior. These behaviors are often linked to career success. So I want to talk about objective and personnel measures of performance. We can measure performance either objectively, through measures of productivity, amount of work produced by an individual, such as the number of cases won by a lawyer, or the number of games won by a coach, the number of publications by a professor, or the number of units produced by a line worker. This is something that we can't compare across jobs usually. The time or effort that it takes to do any one of these items is going to be different for the different jobs. Then we have personnel measures of performance. This includes things like absenteeism, lateness or tardiness, accidents on the job, or disciplinary actions. Some advantages are that these things are easy to interpret, particularly in terms of interpreting the objective measures. It's easy to compare across individuals for such things as absenteeism. It's easy to tie these things to organizational objectives. And it's typically easy to collect these pieces of information. And in fact, a number of them are kept for other reasons as well. So it's a matter of just digging into the archival records of the employees. Some disadvantages of these is that it's not appropriate for all jobs. Productivity measures are not feasible when there's not a countable measure, such as a teacher. These are often deficient as indicators of job performance, as the count of productivity items tends to focus on quantity and not on quality. And they're not always under the control of the individual, such as the sales for salespeople. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the effectiveness or the productivity rather than the actual performance behavior. So if we look at performance appraisal, we can have various components in the content of judgment measures. These could include overall performance, which sometimes has no real meaning. What are they measuring anyway? It's hard to say what the rater is evaluating. It can be influenced by many things. Yet, these overall job performance ratings are commonly used, and they are not particularly good for feedback. If you've ever received a performance appraisal that just gives you an overall, sure, you're doing a good job, what does that tell you about specific things that you're doing well, or things that you could improve upon? It's not particularly helpful. Task performance, which is the performance on the activities that are formally part of the job. This can be evaluating critical tasks or groups of tasks. Incumbents like these because their relevance is obvious. It's easy to tell why you're being judged on the tasks that you're supposed to be performing. Contextual performance. Just as I discussed, this is the extra role behaviors that benefit the organization, that are not technically part of the job, but it definitely adds something above task performance. Adaptive performance is the flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. This is increasingly important, especially in technology jobs and with organizations that are global. Based on judgments, we need someone to judge them. We need to know who the raters are. There are multiple options for raters of performance evaluations. Could be supervisors, peers, etc. Supervisors are the most common. They have extensive observation, often, of employees, though sometimes not. They can provide feedback, one of the critical roles of a supervisor. New technologies reduce the face time with supervisors, so they may not be getting as much observation as they have in the past. The flattening of organizations increase teams, meaning there's less connection with the supervisor. Each supervisor may have more people that they're overseeing. So peers see more of the day-to-day performance of the worker. And because of that, might be a good source of information about what an employee can improve upon. However, there are problems when peer evaluations will be used to determine distribution of fixed resources. If the peers are competing for, say, pay increases or promotions, then the motivation of the peer evaluations is going to change slightly and may influence the outcomes. The employee can rate him or herself. This increases perceptions of fairness. It gives employees a voice, allows them to stand up for what they feel their performance has been. And it helps employees to fully understand the performance process itself. Subordinates or customers may also provide feedback. Subordinates are a good source of information, but not for administrative purposes. In a good position to evaluate leadership performance, but they must be anonymous, so there's no retribution for any negative ratings. Customers are important, particularly in jobs where there is a customer focus. Of course, we can only ask very specific questions that relate to their interactions with the employee. And again, they must be anonymous. There's also a concept called 360-degree feedback. And this is the idea that we get performance feedback from multiple sources. So it could be supervisors, peer, self, and subordinates to give us a full, well-rounded picture of performance from all different viewpoints. So what can rating forms look like? There are various types of items and response options. These include behavioral checklists, which requires the rater to just check off the behaviors that describe an individual. So some of these might be positive behaviors and some will be negative or less positive. And the total score would be based on how many checks were checked off. It's easy to complete, but it's not good for providing feedback because it simply tells the employee, yes, you did this item. Yes, you did this behavior. We have critical incidents, which refer to those things that are either particularly good or particularly bad in making an employee effective. Graphic rating scales, which are the most commonly used tool. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. We have behaviorally based rating forms, which include the behaviorally anchored response scales, or BARS, and behavioral observation scales, BOS. Both of these are the best type of responses to use. Graphic rating scales can look like any of the following. So a rater might be asked, what is the quality of this employee's work? And just have a line, low to high. Put your mark where you feel the employee belongs. Or can be a 1 to 5 rating scale, in which case you're picking a number. Or it may have some verbal anchors, too many errors, about average, occasional errors, or almost never makes mistakes. Here is another example of graphic rating scales. In this performance appraisal form, there are different components of work, including job knowledge, quality of work, productivity, dependability, etc. Each one is to be rated on a scale of either exceeds standards, achieves standards, either marginally or proficiently, or is below standards. One of the things you may or may not notice on here is that there is no indication of what the standards are. This is one of the biggest problems with graphic rating scales. If we think about the job of waiter or waitress, we could have a graphic rating scale that has something like this. Rate the employee on the following. And I've just taken a few of those components from the job task descriptions. Communication of customer orders to kitchen staff, customer service, and accuracy of taking payments. If we look at the behaviorally anchored response scale, the bars, and we wanted to create a form for that, we would try to write critical incidents and then group those into categories. And within each category, identify what low, medium, or high performance is by writing descriptions of what the behaviors would look like. So if we have the tasks that are required of a waiter and waitress, and we pick one out, say collect payments from customers, we would then come up with our critical incidents list. And I've just written a few things here that could fit into critical incidents for taking payment. Charging customers for the wrong items, charging the wrong amount to a card, losing some of the cash, miscounting change, or handing back the credit card to the wrong person. And in developing a scale, we would have something that looks more like this. It has those labels at the top of exceed standards, meet standards, and below standards. However, it has behaviors associated with each one of them to show what it looks like to exceed standards. So in this case, to always correctly charge customers immediately when payment is given, to return the correct change to the customer without assuming tips, and to find errors in calculations, of bills. If we look at below standards, it may be somebody who often miscalculates the bills for customers. It often has to be reminded by customers that they need their bill, and often charges for incorrect items or mishandles and loses cash. So we can have criterion contamination in the form of other factors that lead to criterion contamination in that we have factors that influence our ratings, but are not things we're looking at for performance. These can consist of biases and errors that impact our ratings. So I'm going to do an exercise right now. I would like you to try to remember this list of words. Do not write these down, as that will kind of ruin the effect of the exercise. After I read them, I will ask you to remember the words that you heard. So try to keep these in your mind. Essentially, this is a working memory exercise. So here are the words to remember: book, apple, paperclip, cloak, magazine, hair, shirt, sex, chalk, key, eraser, pen, newspaper, shorts, clip. Now write down all of the words that you remember from that list. So which words did you remember? Here is a graph from a group of students that did this exercise in the past. As you can see, there's a pattern here. There's a high level of recall for the words at the beginning, for one in the middle, and for ones at the end. This is a very typical effect, or a set of effects, for memory recall. And we call this first set that we remember at the beginning of a list the primacy effect. Those at the end are the recency effect. And you can think about recency in terms of the most recent words that you heard. And then the novelty effect. Words that stand out, that are different from the rest of the group. How can these effects affect performance appraisal ratings? It can be common if a supervisor is making ratings, or a coworker, or even yourself, making ratings of performance and trying to remember back about behaviors that occurred. Trying to remember behaviors that were displayed. It's easier to remember items or behaviors that happened more recently. So if you're doing an evaluation of someone over the past 6 months, you may really be looking effectively at the past week or two. What things happened within that past recent time period? And those events or behaviors will affect the performance ratings more so than things that happened during that past previous 5.5 months. The same could be said about novel behaviors. Say an employee does something particularly special or that stands out. Perhaps an employee helped save the life of a customer by knowing CPR. That's a really outstanding thing to have done. And that behavior is going to stand out in the minds and memories of supervisors and coworkers. And perhaps will get more weight than it should, given the behavior at other times. So what other issues in the workplace could this affect? There is one that we've discussed already, and that's job analysis. When we're collecting information on jobs, and we ask about job tasks and the things that people within the job do, we're often going to get a bias on things that are novel or things that have more recently been done. Behaviors or tasks that don't have to be done as often may be forgotten when answering questions about what job tasks the job consists of. This can also apply to any kind of survey that asks employees or supervisors to recall things about the past. When we get into motivation or work attitudes, and we ask about the satisfaction of workers, we're going to find that workers will typically think back in their memory about what has happened and what they are satisfied with, but they will be more affected by the recent past than, say, the typical time period in which the question is asking about. So there are numerous rater biases in error. Some of our common errors involve those memory biases I just discussed: recency, primacy, and novelty. But there are other common errors that we know about as well. For example, halo errors. If you've heard of the halo effect, it's the idea that a rater will generalize from one piece of information to others about that particular person. So for example, if a rater sees a particular employee as being very good with customer service, that rater may also generalize that behavior to other aspects of the employee's performance. So what we find is that the rater gives similar ratings across all dimensions of performance for any one individual. Leniency and severity errors. The rater uses only the favorable or unfavorable end of the scale, and this tends to be a stable trait of the rater. It may be a motivational issue that a rater supervisor doesn't want to be seen as being harsh, so therefore will tend to give lenient or positive performance ratings. Or maybe the person is more severe, feeling like they need to be somewhat critical in order to help employees improve their performance, or have the philosophy that no one is perfect. Central tendency errors. In this case, the rater uses only the middle of the scale. It's often found when raters don't really know much about performance of an individual or know what a particular dimension consists of. It's important in creating appraisal forms to allow for an I don't know or no opportunity to observe option on the rating scale, because there might be legitimate times when a supervisor has not seen a particular aspect of an employee's behavior. So in trying to control rater errors, there are some things we can try to do. We can use more error-resistant forms. This is where those behavioral-based rating scales come in. They're designed to minimize these errors by providing examples of what the standard is for each rating level. By giving behavioral examples, it prevents people from saying, I don't know what excellent behavior would be. Providing rating training. This is intended to familiarize raters with common errors and teach them to avoid those patterns. Evidence indicates that this helps reduce the errors, but at the cost of accuracy. And frame of reference training attempts to provide a common understanding of the rating task. This often involves providing vignettes of good, poor, and average performance to allow raters to know what those look like and to give feedback on the accuracy of their ratings. This has shown to be successful in making performance ratings more accurate. So let's step back and ask why we're evaluating performance. Why do we need to do this at all? There are many reasons why we do performance evaluations. And these different reasons can impact how we go about doing the evaluations and what we need to be concerned with when we do them. So one reason might be for research purposes, and this will include validation studies. So we want to know if our selection process is actually hiring the best employee. When we do these type of studies, we're concerned with the construct validity and reliability of the performance measures. We could also be interested in employee development or training to improving the performance of the individual. And separately, to identify training needs of the employees as a group. In this case, it's important to give very specific constructive feedback and to give that in a written form, to give details of what the behaviors are that are either lacking or that an employee is doing particularly well. It's good in this case to avoid overall assessments. Researchers have found that a great majority of people really want to hear how they're doing on the job. As you can imagine, if you've ever started a job and felt like you don't know whether you're doing the right things at the beginning, you want some kind of feedback. It's a responsibility of supervisors to inform their employees on how they're doing on the job, whether they're meeting expectations, and to help them see areas where they can improve. In terms of training needs, in order to identify developmental opportunities, what should the company spend time on in developing in their employees? If they're going to bring in people from the outside to do maybe a workshop for half a day, what should they be focusing on? These evaluations help determine what those needs are. And then we also evaluate performance for reasons of high stakes decision making. And this includes promotions, pay increases, maybe reassignments. If a company is downsizing, how will they go about reassigning job tasks and maybe combining some tasks together? It's very important when we're doing evaluations for these reasons to be concerned with fairness and accuracy and show that and be transparent in the procedure that's used. We need to be concerned about the motivations of the rater and the ratee. We don't want to have decisions made in which people may get upset and feel like it was not a fair process, or to not know what the process was, in which case it's easy to make judgments about it being unfair if they don't know how the process worked. So there have been challenges to HR decisions based on performance-based evaluations. For example, promotions or terminations. If we look at cases that have been put forward through the courts, we find that subjective methods are more likely to evoke legal challenges because they're more open to prejudice. Werner and Bolino in 1997 took 295 court cases and analyzed them to determine what performance evaluation systems were the most defensible. What they found is that those that were based on job analysis were more defensible. Those that gave written instructions to raters told a rater how to go about doing the evaluation. Those that offered employees an opportunity to have an input were more defensible. And those that used multiple raters. In some performance evaluation systems that I'm familiar with, there is the opportunity for an employee to work with their supervisor to develop goals for the year. In developing those goals, they then become part of the evaluation process. And looking over either a 6-month or a 12-month period, looking back to see to what extent the employee reached those goals that they had laid out. This is one way to use a multiple rater system, and it also gives the employees an opportunity to have an input.